to our honored guests, members of our diplomatic community, and friends from around the world. We are so happy to have you here today as we launch our spring 2022 webinar edition and celebrate our one-year anniversary of A Seat at the Table, Women in Global Leadership. My name is Maureen Pace, and I am the CEO of the World Trade Center Dublin, Ireland, and also serve as Vice President of the Drew Company. As we embark on a new year and a new season, we are pleased to begin our lineup featuring Her Excellency, Dr. Thelma Phillip-Browne, Ambassador St. Kitts and Nevis to the United States. Over the past year, thousands of women have taken a seat at the table and joined us for these intimate and invaluable conversations. Through this series, we have heard from inspirational women leaders who have showcased their unique and sometimes unconventional journeys in diplomacy, international business, trade, and culture. These intimate conversations with current and former ambassadors, dignitaries, global leaders have offered timely insights and have echoed a common theme. And the theme is that women are essential for driving economic growth and social change in their communities, countries, and around the world. This program and series we present to you has been inspired by author Susan Sloan and her book, A Seat at the Table, Women, Diplomacy, and Lessons for the World. Returning as our esteemed moderator, Susan captures personal perspectives and experiences from our dynamic guests, speakers on their successes, overcoming challenges, and journeys to their leading posts. I am really looking forward to hearing from such a trailblazer today, not only on her path in medicine and diplomacy, but also her journey to becoming a global netball champion. She does it all. Before I turn it over, I would like to express how pleased I am to be here representing the World Trade Center Dublin, Ireland, in partnership with the World Trade Center Washington, D.C. The World Trade Center Washington, D.C. is the international programming arm of the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center. For over 20 years, our sister company, TCMA, has proudly served as the exclusive manager of the Ronald Reagan Building through a unique public-private partnership with U.S. General Services Administration. Together, we have developed the Reagan Building into a hub for government, business, global commerce, and cultural exchange. I would like to take this opportunity to share a special thank you to our sponsor, Shaheen D. Mahif, Ring and Ride LLC. Additionally, I would like to recognize our valued promotional partners. Thank you to the Associates of the American Foreign Services Worldwide, Howard University School of Business, and the Women's Business Collaborative. We value your continued support. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's program, Ms. Susan Sloan. In addition to being an author, speaker, diplomacy advocate, and just all-round vibrant woman, Susan is a globetrotter who has already completed a life goal of visiting all 7 continents. She holds a master's degree in global strategic communications from Georgetown University and graduated magna cum laude. We thank you again for joining us this morning and hope that you will enjoy what I am certain will be a fascinating conversation. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. And hello, friends. Welcome back. We're here. It's 2022, and I'm excited to kick off this year with you. I'm Susan Sloan, and you have a seat at the table. You have seen many world leaders in this series and this conversation, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, along with the Ronald Reagan Building, the World Trade Center of DC and Dublin. Thank you to TCMA for making this event and series happen. A Seat at the Table, Women in Global Leadership came about from my book, and it wouldn't happen with many of the people behind the screen right now who have helped make my book and this series possible. So thank you to all of you. You know who you are. In my book, I interview more than 30 women leaders from around the globe. And today we had the pleasure of hearing from one of the women that I interviewed in my book. So the book spans from east to west, north to south, all over many different continents. And all of these women had varying different leadership styles. However, one thing they had in common, each one said to me, who is around the table matters. Now, I could tell you a bunch of statistics and data about why having women at the table creates positive benefits. However, I'm not going to do that today. Statistics and data will not solve gender diversity and gender parity. It's personal. This is why we need these personal stories to understand why it's important and what we can do to change the system. So today, you're here live. However, this is being recorded, so don't worry. If you want to share it with your friends, you can do so. It'll be on the YouTube channel of the Ronald Reagan Building, International Trade Center, about a week after the program. Also, as tradition, please submit any questions you have in the Q&A. If you want to see us online, use the hashtag Where Leaders Lead, at Reagan ITDC, and at The Real Susan Sloan. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our honored guest, Ambassador Thelma Phillip-Browne, representing St. Kitts and Nevis. In addition to being an ambassador, she's also a doctor, dermatologist to be exact, and has a master's in theological sciences and has served as a lay preacher. Lastly, as Maureen mentioned, Ambassador Phillip-Browne has represented St. Kitts in netball for many years. Ambassador, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jan and Maureen, and to the whole group. And thank you to the World Trade Organization for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm excited and look forward to this discussion with you. And thank you to our listening audience as well.
Ambassador, now many folks probably want to know about your upbringing, your background. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and your background.
Thank you, Susan. With your permission, I'll abbreviate this story a little bit because you did it so very well in your book, and I'm going to encourage those persons who are listening to go and read your book and read the stories about these fascinating women. But my story, I'll say, is about a mother who had no seat at the table. She brought all her 8 surviving of her 13 pregnancies, 8 surviving children into the world in a room, as I said, that is smaller, in a house that is smaller than the room in which I live. But she recognized, as you said in your book, that education and a career is the path to authentic leadership and a seat at the table. So though she had no seat at the table, she had very little education, she had that vision, like many of the women of her time. And so she sacrificed to ensure that her son, first son, got into high school. And then stories also about men, because you speak about men who challenge women and who encourage women on this path. And so my father bought into that vision and ensured that all the rest of us went into high school. And there's another man, my oldest brother, once he had gotten into education, gotten secondary education. When my mom died when I was 11 years old, he was 24 years old. And he found himself in charge of his 5 younger siblings who were at home and his nephew. And he took up the mantle, that charge of education. For him, it was not about what you're going to study, where you're going to study, but what you're going to study, not whether you're going to study or if. It was about, and it was not just for us, his siblings and so forth, but throughout his life cycle, that was his mantra. And what is so amazing is when, as he said to a young girl, that was me, who told him that she wanted to be a nurse. And he said, well, if you want to be a nurse, why not be a doctor? He was saying that to a young girl who had no role models in terms of a woman as a doctor. We had no women as doctors in the Federation. And in fact, at that time, most doctors were men. He was saying that to a young girl who had no background in science, because at that time, the girls' high school did not teach science until we merged very late in life. And he was saying that to a young girl who had no economic means, he knew, of getting to university. So when he challenged me in that way, it was a remarkable thing to do. And he challenged and supported me through that long struggle. And then the third thing I want to say, it was also about a community of women who had no seat at the table. Women in a very poor area. And in fact, it was a tale of two worlds. It was such a poor neighborhood. In fact, I know one friend who usually says, can any good thing come out of Newtown? I mean, there was the good, the bad, and the ugly. There was abuse and cursing and drinking and all these negative things. But amidst that group, there were some powerful women who are truly CEOs of their households, not just their households, but the communities. And two stand out for me. One we called Ma, because she was like a community mother. Her name was Mabel Fraser. And when my mom died, when I was 11, and the only other woman in the house was 14, my oldest sister was 14 years. I mean, often we'd have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, go outside into the kitchen to cook the meal. Sometimes we'd fall asleep and burn the food. And Ma would step in and make sure that there was something for us to eat at lunchtime. And she sort of shepherded us through that adolescence and into womanhood. And the other person's name, we called her Auntie Butty. Again, she was a global aunt for the community. Her name was Isme Burt. She was a teacher. And for that time in that community, that itself was remarkable. Because most women didn't work or did very menial job, because she had been teaching since she was 13 years old. And just how she carried herself with dignity and deportment was a role model for us. But besides that, she would come home at afternoons, and many afternoons, she would teach handicraft, basket weaving, crocheting, things like that. So kept the young girls off the streets. And so without these women providing these benevolent experiences to counteract the adverse experiences of our childhood, one knows where many of us would have been. And in fact, because of their insight, they had no seat at the table. And because of their insight, their offspring and their family members and friends, and so many have seats at the table in boardrooms and classrooms and hospitals and universities right across the hemisphere. And so the tribute goes to them. And the last thing I'll say in terms of that is, we in the Caribbean will never face inequality and racism a la the George Floyd type moments, because most of us look like me, are Black, and the persons in power, the policemen, the government, teachers, most of them look like us. But it is there. It is below the radar to some extent, but it is there. And even in families, in terms of the difference in complexion of the skin, and whether your hair is as kinky or your hair is straighter, we know that it is there. And I want, since this was not in the book, to share one example.
Sure, please.
When my mom, just before, a few years before she died, she sent me to live with my godmother's sister. They were economically in the class above us. They were much better off than we were. And also she lived in a upscale neighborhood. And also she was a lighter complexion, long hair, so you know, this was a different class in our time. And there I would help with the chores and keep her company, because she's an elderly lady who lived alone. And yet when she prepared a meal, she would say, child, she'd never call me by my name. She would say, child, and she'd take a chair from the dining room table and carry it into the kitchen. And that's where I'd eat. And then she'd go in the dining room to eat. So there were just two of us, but I ate in the kitchen and she ate in the dining room. And during the time that I lived there, she extended the building. She built, she was using outdoor toilet and bathroom, and that came indoors. She got indoor plumbing, as we call it, flush toilet and bathroom. And I was so excited because my family didn't have that. And I went and I told them, because I assumed I was going to use indoor plumbing. And lo and behold, I still had to use the outhouses. When my mom died, my grandmother brought me home. And we were coming home the day, I'll never forget, we were coming home that day. And there was a lady, very light skinned. My grandmother was really, really dark. And the lady shouted an insult to us because of my grandmother's complexion, whatever dispute they had. And I stood there in stunned silence because I knew who it was and I didn't expect that. And my grandmother just said, let's go. She never mentioned it again until the day she died. She never raised it. But
Wow.
as I got older, and those things is stuck in my mind because discrimination is painful. And especially as it refers to things that you have no control of, whether it's your gender or it's the color of your skin, it can be painful. But I learned during my journey, and especially when I was studying, a couple of things that my grandmother didn't explicitly say, but I learned there's a scripture that says, as much as is possible, live at peace with all men, as much as lies within you. Because it is not, you can't control what someone else does and says, but you can control your reaction to it. And I believe in today's world, it is so important that we strive as much as possible, as much as lies within us, to live at peace with all men. And I think that is something a lot of women could bring to the table. And I remember, as I reflect on it, Vian Eisler writes about the chalice and the blade, and about the real wealth of nations. And it's that caring and sharing that enables us to do that. And the second thing I learned was, as time went on, I understood from that, is that I didn't create myself. I didn't make myself woman. I didn't make myself Black. But I was created that way. The Creator knew what he was doing. He made no mistake, and it was for a reason. And it was for me not to be sidetracked by what others think of who I am, something I have no control of, but to understand that I was created and created this way for a purpose. The purpose I alone can fulfill. I'm a unique being. And as I told you before, and as I said in the book, in the tapestry of life, we are like skeins of wool. And whatever color we are, whether we are Black, we are white, we are pink, we are blue, we are purple, we are brown, we have a particular slot to complete that tapestry. And we need to shine where we are and be the best color that we can be in order to enhance that tapestry.
So true, Ambassador, so true. And I know you also mentioned a similar saying that I have in my book. So thank you. And I love that. And I'd be remiss not to mention, as this month is Black History Month, and being a woman and a woman of color, I'm curious what comes to mind when you think about this month. And in addition, we have a question from the audience. Karen Goldstein asks, what is the culture like for women in the Caribbean? So if you can encompass that, we'd love to hear more.
Okay, what comes to mind? I went to Ghana just before in 2019. I went to Ghana. See, I have my kente thought. And I stood in the dungeons and I envisaged these were rooms where by the tens and the dozens, men and women stood day and night, one bath a month and one meal a day as they waited for the ships to take them to the New World. And about half of them died there. And as I drove across the terrain, I realized that about half of them had died on the way in chains just to get to the dungeon. And another half had died in the fights that brought them to this package, the fights that had them, the enslaved, that captured them in the confrontations during which they were captured. If 12 million people left Ghana, or left the shores of Africa, and 5 to 6 million reach the shores of the New World, of the Americas. It must have been about 100 million people involved in this carnage, the greatest carnage the world has ever seen. Mm. Also, especially the men, most of them died within 5 years of reaching to the New World, especially in the Caribbean, because they were overworked. And in fact, the author, John Newton of Amazing Grace, brought slaves to the region. And he wrote in his memoirs that he was told that the planters decided it was easier and cheaper to work these people to death and buy more slaves than treat them humanely. And so I think to myself, if we are here, those of us who have survived, because our ancestors survived, when so many millions died, then we ought to look at that history and say, it's by grace that we were here, the resilience and the resourcefulness. And so I think we are some of the most resourceful people on the face of the earth. And that is what comes to mind, how precious we are and our life is. So don't let anybody else tell us otherwise. Women in the Caribbean, and so Black women, because so many of the men died, the women have always been the backbone of the Caribbean. And there was a book by Edith Clark, My Mother Who Fathered Me, because as I said, so many of the men died and the women really socially were the social and still are the social background. But imagine these women are what I call the CEOs of your homes. They take care of education and the health and make sure there's peace and make sure there's food and everything. They do that, especially in the Caribbean and worldwide, and says it's not just the Caribbean, not just the 17,000 households in St. Kitts and Nevis, or the 132 million households in the US, the 500 and something million households in China. Almost all of the 1.67 million households in the world will have the women as the CEOs. And yet, as we go up the ladder, they lose that opportunity. They don't get a seat at the table. And the verse I read this morning said, if you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in much. And yet we don't get a seat at the table. And that's why we need, if we are going to be the CEOs of our households, what is the community but a collection of households, or the world but a collection of households, and the facilities to enable that household to thrive. And so for that reason alone, we need a seat at the table. Women in the Caribbean have been the backbone, but yet we have not risen as we should, especially in politics and in business, to the leadership positions. And we give thanks for those men. There are a lot of men who would move over and encourage us and give seats at the table, but they are still not quite enough.
Agree. And, yes, women play the CEO role in many parts of their lives, whether it's in the household or in groups and communities. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of CEOs where we just need more to be hired.
Yes.
In previous conversations, Ambassador, when we spoke with Ambassador Milan Verveer and Ambassador Swanee Hunt, we spoke about war and conflict. And how having women at the table changes the conversation. And right now on many people's mind is Ukraine and conflict and the aggression that's going on in that region. And one of our guests today, Reverend Mark Farr, president of the Sustained Dialogue Institute, wants to know a little bit more about Ukraine as well. And is there a distinctive difference that women make in diffusing world conflict? And what's a specific woman's perspective?
Okay. So, and you wrote in your book, and you rightly say that there's a 60%, I think, less chance of failure if women are involved. And then actually, if women get a seat at the table and resolving conflict, it said that you have 25% increased chance of getting peace and sustaining that peace. And I mentioned Rian Eisner, and I go through it again, because her books, The Chalice and the Blade, The blade she speaks about is about dominance and submission, and it's more about a male challenge, dominance. This is how I'm going to solve it, and I'm going to solve it with a dominant attitude, and you must submit. And the chalice is about sharing and caring. In her book, The Real Wealth of Nations, she also speaks to that sharing and caring and how it's missing. And I think that's exactly what is needed. You also speak about, you mentioned in the book, that someone said that men are the hunter-gatherers and the women, the hunters, and women are the gatherers. As one person termed it, men see in straight line and women see around the corners. We look at all eventualities because we have to consider every person's issue. And that's why I think we bring a different perspective to the table. But even how we are made up when it comes to whether it's testosterone versus estrogen or the parts of the brain that are dominant, that's how we are made up. To sit back a little bit and reason more and empathize. And that empathy is a quality that is missing. And that over the past 40 years, that has been on steady decline, empathy, it is said, in our world. And that, I think, is what women bring to the table. An ability to empathize, an ability to put themselves in others' shoes, an ability to look from a broader perspective and come to more reasoned and reasonable decision. And that's why they're needed at the table.
100%. And I believe more women, especially helping with Ukraine, can only be helpful.
Yes.
And hopefully there will be a peaceful solution figured out.
Yes, yes, yes. And I wish that sometimes, you know, you see they take polls, and I wonder sometimes if they ask the women, you know, specifically the women in Ukraine, what do they want? Because most women want peace. And will do whatever they need to do to have peace.
Yes. And I see a few more questions coming in, and there's two that are quite similar, and I'm going to pair them together. And it's about advice for young women, we could say young ladies or girls, but young women who maybe have lost some hope and don't see a path for the future. And on the flip side of that, have this advice for young girls and women who may hesitate at the chance to take a seat at the table, even if they have the capacity. What advice can you give to these young women?
You never give up. And I'm going to tell a little bit about my story. And I mentioned that my brother said to me that, you know, I told him I wanted to be a nurse. And he said, why not be a doctor? So I did not do sciences, as I said, from the very beginning of my high school. It was not until I was in 4th grade, which is the equivalent of 11th grade here, that the science was introduced. And I was not going to take up all these sciences at one time. But because my brother had encouraged me and said I should do medicine, I took up at least one, and that was chemistry. So I was doing languages and arts right through, and I also did chemistry. So we got to the sixth form about late, and I don't have the resources, so I could only get to university by a scholarship. So I signed up for a scholarship exam. So at that sixth form level, which is, I think might be a grade 13, you have, it might be a grade 13. I was doing English, French, and chemistry. But I was more tuned towards the arts and more of the arts. And the morning when the chemistry exam was supposed to be scheduled, the practical exam, I was at home. I missed the date, and I was at home. And by the time they realized and the master came for me, half the exam had gone. And so I failed chemistry. And then I was going to write chemistry and English for the scholarship exam to get into university. And I went to the exam the afternoon to write chemistry and saw a young man in my class who I knew did math. And I'm saying, well, what are you doing here? And he said, we're doing maths. I said, no. We went to the I can't remember his name now, but he ran the Department of Extramural Studies. And he said, yes, chemistry was in the afternoon, was in the morning. So I'd missed that as well. So on 2 occasions, I'd missed the chemistry exams. And I said to myself, there's no way I'm going to give up and tell my brother that I missed the chemistry twice, so my own carelessness. And so I went and I said, what else can I do? And the French exam had not come as yet. So I signed up to do French. So I did for the entrance exam, for the scholarship exam, I did French and English and managed to pass that and got a scholarship, Princess, which enabled me to go and do whatever I could. So I was able to do science at Cave Hill. So the thing is, no matter what the obstacle, I'm saying, you can find a way to do it. You might have to put in a little bit of extra work, but if where there is a will, there is a way. And so never give up. And don't let anyone tell you, what you know. You look within yourself and try to understand yourself. Remember that you are created for a special purpose. I can fulfill that purpose and no one else can. You alone can fill that slot. And so you examine yourself and find out what you're created to do, what you want to do, and focus on that and don't let anything distract you. Remember always, the sky is the limit, so long as you're willing to put the effort into it.
I agree. And I often find that we ourselves are our own first challenge, yes. Our own first roadblock, yes. That we say no to ourselves. And so I believe the first step is saying yes to yourself, and yes, you can do it. So Ambassador, I completely agree with you on that. And we have many more questions coming in. This is very exciting. So keep putting your questions in, audience. We are getting to them. A question from a friend of mine and reporter, Larry Luxner. He wants to know how many women serve as ambassadors in Washington. Larry, there's not gender parity. So it doesn't matter how many women are there. We're not at parity yet.
No, I think there were maybe about 27. I think recently we have a few more, but I guess with all this COVID and we're not seeing each other, I think may have missed. But I think it's about 27 or so, or maybe might go up to about 30. Jan, do you know?
Well, yes, specifically, he wants to know about, as you represent a smaller nation in size and population, tell us what that's like when you're working in the diplomatic field, especially in Washington.
Okay, so we caucus here as a CARICOM group. And CARICOM is comprised of 15 permanent members, 14 independent countries and Montserrat, and 5 associate members. This CARICOM is the Caribbean community. And usually when we caucus in the US, the bilateral relations, they deal with us as a group. So we caucus as a CARICOM group. It's the CARICOM unity is based on 4 pillars: economic integration, foreign policy alignment, or economic alignment, foreign policy coordination, security, and social development. So along those lines, that we work together along those lines. And in dealing with the US, for this Congress or its Department of State, we work along those lines. In 2020 and 2019, and then into 2020, the CARICOM Strategic Initiative was CARICOM 2020 was passed, and that the US engages with us under that, on the 6 pillars: health, education, prosperity, diplomacy, which is public engagement, diaspora engagement, and things like that, security, and energy. And so, what we did among ourselves is to divide ourselves into committees. And so, for instance, I'm with the health committee. I'm chair of the health committee. Health and education is now together chair. So we sort of divide it like that. and we pursue our engagement along these lines with these to make life easier for us. Because it's, especially when we are, Caribbean, we are an area that is largely peaceful. The US has a surplus with us. And so we're not so much on the radar, and some people feel we get sort of left behind. And that is unfortunate because we are extremely important, and we are not just about sun and sand. The Caribbean, in fact, and going back, the Caribbean region was responsible for lots of development in the US and United Kingdom. It is because of the slave trade and the plantation system why the Industrial Revolution in the UK was financed. Lots of banks and insurance companies and universities and schools were built because of that. And in fact, the first colonies in the US were supported because of what was going on in the Caribbean region. So we try always to portray that as we are little, but we are important, and we need to be heard. And so we try to push our issues along those lines. Now we are the smallest of the countries. And of course, you're little and some tend to get overlooked. But I always say, the smaller you are, you can be a petri dish. And so there are things that could be tried in our little island, which can be a blessing to the entire community in terms of things like climate change, issues to do with climate change and things like that. You can look at a small community, because what is a big nation but a collection of smaller communities? So, but it's a pleasure to serve. It's something I was not trained in it, and so I have to continuously be learning. It's a learning process, and you learn to work together. In terms of one of the things you find is that because we have a unity, a CARICOM body, and we're the oldest surviving union in that respect, but we are also individual countries, individual sovereign countries. And so sometimes there are little issues because we have different alignments. And right now, some persons are aligned with China, some like us are aligned with Taiwan. And so sometimes you get these little conflicts, but by and large, we caucus together and we work together to find common ground on issues that affect us all and affect our countries.
Which is something that women do very well, is finding common ground.
Yes. And we have in CARICOM, we have been fortunate. We are pretty well represented. We had 5 female ambassadors. 5 or 14 is not bad. Is better than the average. And for St. Kitts Nevis, we have parity. We have 50 female ambassadors. We have 50% of our ambassadors are female.
That's great. It's fantastic. And to go back to that number again, to Larry, there seems to be around 40 women ambassadors in Washington, D.C. And Larry, I'm going to let you fact check that. So make sure you fact check that, but it should be around 40. We have another question from the audience from Michelle, who's with the U.S. Diplomacy Center Foundation, and it's about childcare. Here in the United States and in many countries around the world, there's not affordable or accessible childcare and the availability of it. Michelle is curious to know, in your country, Ambassador, are there nurseries or childcare facilities and places of work? How readily available is it? Is it affordable? How do families have childcare in the country and work?
Well, that's an important question. In fact, looking at COVID, as you look at COVID and the issues, and women were more heavily affected by COVID. And a lot of it is also, apart from job loss and so forth, finding childcare has been one of the issues where women have lost a lot of the gains they've made around the world because of COVID. And a lot of it is related to the inability to find childcare. Fortunately for us, we don't have that much of a problem there. It's a small country, but the government, we have almost 60 childcare facilities in St. Kitts and Nevis. believe it or not. The government has childcare facilities, and then they have a number of private childcare facilities. So that really is not an issue. Childcare is very good in St. Kitts and Nevis. In fact, too, we have a child month in June, and you see all these childcare participants and teachers and so forth come and do parades, and childcare is really not an issue. We don't have as much of parental leave, and we are working on that. But childcare, that's no issue at all for us. We do have a lot of childcare support.
That's very fortunate. Hopefully the US can follow suit and get more childcare options and availability.
Yeah, childcare and things like public health, because when you look at COVID, the region of the Americas, the population is about 13% of the global population. The reported case rate is we have in the region of Americas about 32% of the reported cases and about 42% of the deaths. And it is not that COVID itself discriminates, but it highlights the disparities. And the public health service, because if you look at the Caribbean region, our infectious rate was low and the death rates were low. We fared pretty well. And that is because we have much better public health systems and support systems, access to better public health. And we have more of a coordination with institutions like CARFA and PAHO and so forth. So these kind of public facilities are much better off. And that's probably one of the reasons why we fared a little better. So you have work to do. You do have work to do.
There's always work to do, Ambassador, isn't there?
Yes, in developing the public health structure and affordable childcare, etc.
And I see two questions have come in that are similar in a sense. One from Vanessa about how to navigate spaces that are predominantly reserved for men without becoming exhausted or burnout and feeling like you need to prove yourself. And on the flip side, a similar question from Masi, who her name's Sylvia, and she's a young leader. She's 25 years old. She's from Ghana, and she leads a women entrepreneurs organization, about 3,000 women. And even though she's performing really well in this position, many more seasoned men and women don't accept her because she's so young and question her leadership for such a huge organization. And so she's asking about how to maintain a seat at the table. So both of these questions go to maybe when you're in predominantly more seasoned groups or predominantly male groups, and you feel that maybe the seat isn't reserved for you. How do you reserve your seat? Yep. How do you keep that seat? And how do you not be exhausted and burn out to not try to have to prove yourself all the time?
Okay. So it reminds me when I was doing my internship in Trinidad and Tobago, I was on the orthopedic ward one day, and I heard these two young boys, two young patients, and they were in a heated argument, and I couldn't figure what they were arguing about. And so I drew near and listened to them. And the argument was about whether nursing was a doctor or a nurse. And I realized after they were talking about me, they were both calling me nursing, but they were arguing as to whether I was a doctor or nurse. So even the one who said she's a doctor was still calling me nursing. And I smiled because in the environment, the doctors who had the seat at the table, they were mostly men. But you can't let that bother you. As I said, you focus. You have to stay focused and believe that you have a seat at that table. You are created for a seat at that table. So it still goes back to You can't control anybody but your own self, and you have to believe in yourself. No, they have to be supporting organizations, and that is why you need more women in these organizations to support. Because if you look at the Women, Business and the Law Index, we have made gains. It's now 75. It means that women have 75% of the rights globally, legal rights that men have. Only 10 countries in this world that women have parity before the law. And those include Canada is the only one in this hemisphere. You have countries, you have Sweden, France, Latvia, Luxembourg, Iceland, Ireland, and I think Belgium and Denmark. I think those are, I'm not sure if I have all the 10, but they're ones. They have 100% parity before the law. We have made gains, which we might have lost some during COVID. We have made gains, but we're still not there. Imagine we are still, before the law, just 75% equity. And that may, in terms of, and they look at things like, in terms of property ownership, access to financing, they look at mobility, the workplace information. In 2013, when the Women Banking and the Law Index started, women did 66%, they found 66% of the world's work, produced 50% of the world's food, earned 10% of the world's wages, and owned 1% of its property. So it is a battle, it is a struggle. We have made inroads, but we have to persevere. And so we can't move, and we have to believe in our minds that we have earned a seat at the table. Sometimes, people use religion to encourage disparities, and everyone can look at religion and pick things out which suit them. But one of the things that I always remind myself of, if you believe in the scriptures and you go to Genesis 2, and it said, it's not good for man to be alone. I'll find him a helper suitable for him. The word there is Ezer Kenegdo. Ezer is a helpmate parallel to him. So we were not meant, and we have to understand that. We were not meant to be inferior. We were meant to be parallel to. It's about complementing. We are different, but equal. And parallel to two parallel lines will never meet, but they are equal going forward. And so these are things, no one can do it for us. My brother often tells me, a man is not going to do it for you. We have to believe in ourselves and go back to the beginning. We were created equal. It's just in the same way that in terms of a pigment, they say, I have more melanin than you. You have more melanin, which gives me that dark color. But I am no less capable than you. I'm equal. We are different, but we are equal. So it's about complementing each other because of our differences, but not one superior to the other. None. So it's about complementarity and not competition, not domination. But it's something that we have to tell ourselves in the face of all that's coming against us and say, no, we have to strengthen ourselves, and we have to have the people around us who could encourage us and support us, because that is really, really key to have that kind of support. So associate yourself with persons who can always encourage you to stay on that right track.
And it sounds like having that people surround you that are encouraging you, that could be advice for many different women and different leaders. And speaking on that note, I see a question coming in from a friend, Ambassador Lena Omar, asking that if you had a message for women ambassadors that are in the Middle East, what message would you have for them on how to continue to have a seat at the table, especially in a very male-dominated society?
But I've never, I've been to Dubai. I have not been anywhere else, but we all have read and know the issues, and we know that it is very challenging. But if as a Black woman we can overcome, then anybody can. And it goes back to believing in yourself and sticking to your guns. And it may not be, you may not be the beneficiary of it if you keep on fighting. You yourself may not be the beneficiary, but someone else coming behind. You pave the way for someone else coming behind. And that is, to me, just as important, because there are probably so many forces, counteracting forces that militate against that. But you stick to your guns. An important thing is to pave the way for others who are coming behind. And this is a very troubled world. And but there's a saying that says, look to the ant and be wise. The ant is a very, very tiny creature. The ants have no leaders, but they work together. They know what needs to be done. They work together. They stick to the guns, and you see all of them working together to push a little piece of food to where they're going. But what they do, they leave a chemical trail behind for others to follow. So as difficult as it is, and without knowing your exact circumstance, you know, I can say, but as difficult as it is, you just keep pressing on and you keep pushing that message. But more importantly, leave a trail for others, because you may not succeed, but as sure as night follows day, the others would come along and benefit from that.
And speaking of that, of following others and family ties and thinking about generations and connections, we have a question from Chantel, whose parents are from St. Kitts and Nevis. And although she's born in Canada, her parents are from your country. And she wants to know how people in the diaspora living outside of the country can still contribute to the country. And how do we facilitate more women leaders in St. Kitts and Nevis?
Okay. So in terms of the diaspora, the Caribbean is an area that has almost 80% of its intellectual capacity outside of the region. We have a serious brain drain, and obviously we can facilitate all the people coming back. But when I was about to take up this job, I had a talk with a very wise gentleman who's now deceased. He was the head of our East Caribbean Central Bank. And when I was talking to him and about what I hope that we could, in terms of getting the diaspora involved, because I figure if we have so much of our intellectual capacity outside, we need to get them involved. For me, of my 8 siblings, I'm the only one who studied in the Caribbean and remained there. So all of my nieces and nephews and my siblings are in North America. So I know what we needed. And he said to me, what you're saying is reflective of a book called The New Argonauts. And I bought that book, and what it said during the time of the dot-com boom and all that stuff in Silicon Valley, a lot of the Chinese and the Israelis and the Indians who had come here and studied and businesses and done well, went back home and built, and they did not necessarily stay at home, but they went and built these companies and formed what you call diaspora bonds and circles. So they moved throughout, and that built up technology in Israel and India and China. So because they kept these diaspora bonds and circles. So that is what we need to do, get these diaspora bonds and circles going. So the first thing we need to do is get in touch with your embassy. There's a high commission in Ottawa. So get in touch with your high commissioner. So state, because, and sometimes we have these diaspora associations. We would have St. Kitts and Nevis associations. We have Caribbean groups, but we need to connect, get in touch with them and to let them know what your skills are. So you keep a database. And so when we need these people, we know where to tap. because we need really to establish these diaspora bonds and circles. Now, for us, it has been a little bit more difficult because for years, people, went back mostly to vote and left again. But we want people to stay engaged. Now, sometimes, and I have heard people in diaspora complain that, you go and give them advice and they say, oh, you just come back, you've been out so long and you come back and want to tell us what to do. And then people at home might say, oh, you're out a long time, so you stay out and, But I think it's always how you do things. It's not what you do, but how you do it. So we have to find a way. And that's where the embassies, the high commissions can bridge that gap between the diaspora and the countries, because we really need to bridge it, and we need to form these bonds and circles that people get involved in the communities. In terms of women, I always say we are our own worst enemy, because many women would rather vote for a man than vote for a woman. And it is so all around. And I don't really know how we get past that, but by continuing to press, continue to do what you are doing, present women in leadership so that they can be encouraged and they have role models, and stop, bad talking each other and saying negative things about each other, and purpose in our heart, just as there are men who would say, I would vote for a man. There's nothing wrong to me saying, I would vote for a woman because she's a woman. Because invariably, if a woman puts herself out there, it is because she is super qualified, because she knows how she's going to be toned down. So she is super qualified. She does not put herself out there unless she is super qualified. So let's give women a chance. And not say, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Well, Ambassador, we are at time, and it's been such a wonderful conversation, and there are far more questions that folks have. Again, to our audience, if you want to reach the ambassador, please reach out to our good friend Allison McKeeshan. Her email address is in the chat, so if you didn't get your question asked, feel free to send it to Allison and she will get it to the ambassador. A special thank you to, of course, Ambassador and the World Trade Center in Washington, D.C. and Dublin, and to you, our audience. Again, this program is recorded and will be up on YouTube within a week. Our next program is on March 29th. Make sure to follow us on social media. Use the hashtag seat at the table and the hashtag where leaders lead. I'm Susan Sloan, and you have a seat at the table. And now let's hear from the World Trade Center of Dublin.
Wow, thank you, Susan, for leading such a wonderful, informative, and inspiring discussion with another dynamic woman leader. I just wish, as I'm sure the entire audience does, that we had more time to continue the conversation. On behalf of the World Trade Center, Washington, D.C., and the World Trade Center, Dublin, Ireland, I wish to extend our gratitude to Ambassador Phillip-Browne for her wonderful insights today as we learned more on the progress of women leadership, and to Susan, who as always has led us through such an engaging conversation. Thank you to our audience as well for tuning in. Please follow us at Reagan ITC DC and subscribe to our social channels. Thank you, and I wish you all much peace and prosperity.